Welcome to Public Enemy Number 1, the police whistleblower. When I started the podcast in July of this year, my only real intention was to share my story and get more Canadians interested in the topic of whistleblower protection. But along that journey, I came to realize that Canadians don't even really have an understanding of where we're at now in order to understand why things have to change. I'm going to start episode 1 of season 2 with a general overview of whistleblower laws in Canada and how deficient they really are. I mean, as I mentioned throughout my story, there is absolutely no protection for municipal police officers in Canada when they come forward with an internal concern. That's precisely why I faced immediate retaliation when I made my disclosure to the board, and why I'm still facing retaliatory litigation going into my 6th year after resignation. I ended season 1 telling you that I was off to judicial review at the Divisional Court on November 22nd. Well, it's been 1 week since that hearing, and I don't expect their decision anytime soon. So for now, the question still remains: will the police service be permitted to proceed with their human rights complaint against me, despite the fact that I never agreed to be silenced? So while we wait for that answer, let's take a deep dive into Canada's whistleblower laws. Now, you can find all of these statutes online, but for this episode, I'm actually flipping through the pages of my first book. In 2017, I released The Systemic Misfeasance in Ontario Policing and the Coordinated Suppression of Whistleblowers. And yeah, I was not trying to write a book that was going to be an easy read, but what I wanted to do is put together a compilation of cases from across Canada. I wanted to illustrate how many other police officers had tried to do the right thing and faced retaliation for doing so. I actually do refer to this book quite a bit because it is a compilation of Canada's current whistleblower laws. I talk about cases of harassment, discrimination, times where police officers tried to report things like sexual abuse and excessive force. But in almost every one of those cases, it's the officer reporting the crime that gets in trouble. Now, I wrote this book in 2017, but if I were to write another book today, I could fill another 300 pages with cases from across Canada that have happened just since 2017. We're still allowing our government to silence police whistleblowers, and there's been a very recent case where I'd like to highlight this. You can do your own research and look up these articles on the internet, but I'm going to read from a Barrie CTV News article. It talks about how on September 7th, 2019, an OPP officer arrested a woman and took her back to the Orillia OPP detachment. Now, before I get into this story, you have to understand, if you don't know by now, I'm not anti-police. I'm pro-honesty. And in this case, I'm not trying to target the affected police officer or anyone involved in the incident. I'm going to speak about this incident to highlight the systemic issues, the number of people that were involved in this incident, the lack of reporting, the neglect of duty. It's the systemic problems that I have been trying to address since day one. The incident involved a female prisoner being injured in the cell block and having to be transported to the hospital to get staples in her head. Again, this was 2019, but nothing had been reported to the SIU, and it doesn't appear that there was any investigation at the time. Now, first little sidebar in this episode, since I went public in 2017, I do have a lot of police officers that reach out to me. They're either whistleblowers or potential whistleblowers, and they look to me for advice. Now, in this particular case, I didn't know about the whistleblower ahead of the incident, but I was kept in the loop of things as they progressed. So what I know is that this whistleblower spent significant time and effort to try to have the incident investigated by the SIU. When it really seemed like nobody cared, the whistleblower pressed on. Despite the threats of a misconduct investigation and despite even receiving a cease and desist letter from the Attorney General's office, the whistleblower did not give up. It was only after the whistleblower alerted the media to what had happened that the SIU decided to investigate. In the end, the police officer was charged with assault caused bodily harm and convicted in October of 2023. So now that the case has been in the public realm, we now know that after the incident in the cell block, the officer made the efforts to clean up the crime scene. There is mention of her informing her supervisor of the incident, but there's no mention at the end of the day as to what disciplinary action has been taken against all the other officers that knew what had happened and did not report the incident to the SIU. But I believe what should concern the public the most in this case is that none of this would have ever been brought to light if this individual whistleblower hadn't gone to the lengths they had to go to. And the fate of that whistleblower is no different than every other police whistleblower that came before them. They're no longer a police officer, and they're most likely living with mental health injuries as a result of the ordeal. So welcome to policing in Canada. I mention this specific case because it illustrates a lot of the problems with policing in Canada. Now, again, as I've said, I'm not anti-police, and I don't have anything against this particular officer that was charged and convicted. I do think that the night in question, this particular officer may have been stressed out. She might be dealing with something at home. Maybe she's overtired. I mean, there could be a number of reasons why in that incident she overreacted and used excessive force. Like every other citizen in Canada, when you make a mistake and you commit an offense, you have to be held accountable. I know that police are not above the law, and I don't think they should be treated any differently. But in this case, as in many other cases across the country, you have a police association representing both sides of an argument. You have the subject officer that was accused and convicted, and you have the whistleblower. So why is it that police associations will rally behind an officer accused and even convicted of a criminal offense, yet not even acknowledge the existence of the whistleblower who made it all happen in the first place? I mean, if we're looking at this from purely a union representative perspective, maybe we'd say, well, yes, that's their obligation. But where are the ethical considerations behind that? Is it not the courageous whistleblower cop that came forward with the case in the first place, exposing something in the public interest, who should be getting representation from his police association? But that's not what happens. I mean, when you look at every case across the country, when a police officer is trying to expose something internally, rarely, if ever, do they have the support of their police association. But you do your own cursory search and you see how many police officers in Canada are convicted of criminal offenses while being fully represented by their police association. Hopefully you've concluded by now that everything I'm doing because I believe it is in the public's interest to know this information. I can't be the only one that wonders what else is not being reported. I mean, I'm in a unique situation because, as I said, police whistleblowers reach out to me all the time for support. So I know exactly what's not being reported. But what I'm trying to get the public to realize is that there is a lot that they're not being told. There is a lot that doesn't get reported. There is a lot that just gets managed internally that doesn't do anything to improve transparency or accountability in policing in Canada. So let's move on with what we came here to do today. I'm going to explain to you the current whistleblower laws that exist in Canada. I'm going to specifically be talking about Ontario because I'm not necessarily familiar with each provincial piece of legislation. But for starters, in Canada, as far back as 2004, our Criminal Code of Canada has recognized the need to protect whistleblowers. In Section 425.1, it says that it is a criminal offense for employers, anyone acting on behalf of an employer or a person in a position of authority over an employee, to take disciplinary action, demote, terminate, otherwise adversely affect the employee's employment, or threaten any of those things in order to force the employee to refrain from providing information to law enforcement officials about the commission of an offense by his or her employer. It sounds like a good piece of law, and it might actually work to protect certain people in certain circumstances. But I wonder if the government ever considered What if your employer is the police? To whom do you make this complaint of criminal activity contrary to Section 425.1? If you think back to that cell block assault, it was the whistleblower who was actually threatened with the cease and desist letter. He wasn't given any protection when he tried to report something that he believed was the commission of a criminal offense. It was the provincial government that was trying to stop him from doing that. So wasn't the provincial government committing a criminal offense contrary to Section 425.1? I'm giving you this information in this way, not to be cheeky, but because I want you to see how ridiculous this is. We have these laws in place, but we're not even upholding the principles that resulted in the creation of these laws. We're not giving protections to the people that have the courage to come forward and report these things. So we've made it a crime to go after an employee if they try to report something to law enforcement. But what else have we done? Well, the following year, we created the Public Servants Disclosure Protection Act, and that is to protect federal employees, but only certain employees, and you can only report certain kinds of misconduct about certain people. There have been recent reviews of this legislation, and I'll let you do that homework, but clearly the legislation is not working. The end results of most of these complaints are that they just don't get investigated, or if they are investigated, it's really hard to determine any wrongdoing. I cite a couple of cases in my book where whistleblowers tried to utilize the Public Servants Disclosure Protection Act to report wrongdoing. In one of those cases, the wrongdoing was reported about the Atomic Energy Canada Limited in 2007. The employee that made the report was terminated in 2008. In 2009, the employee filed a reprisal complaint, but he still had to wait 7 years. And in the end, his complaint was withdrawn and he accepted a settlement. So what did that case do to improve any level of transparency and accountability within government? In 2006, Ontario enacted the Public Service of Ontario Act, but again, it only applies to certain provincial public servants and only for certain types of wrongdoing. To the best of my knowledge, which was current in 2017, the Act did not prohibit reprisal against a whistleblower. The one thing I found disturbing about this piece of legislation is that the Office of the Integrity Commissioner posts disclosure summaries to their website, but they don't include any names of public servants alleged or even found to have committed wrongdoing. So what does this entire process do to improve transparency and accountability? I'm always left with that same question, but I'm not the only one. So the Government Accountability Project recently did a study where they ranked 60 countries in order of how well they protect their whistleblowers. It might not surprise you to know that Canada placed last out of 60 countries. We were tied for last with Lebanon and Norway. Now, as I said, we have legislation to protect certain federal government employees and certain provincial government employees, but there's still nothing protecting the municipal police officer who tries to do the right thing. So if you listened to season 1, you know that when I resigned in 2017, I made it my goal to educate lawmakers on why it's so important to provide protections for municipal police officers. There were some minor changes to the laws in 2018, but it seems that as soon as the Conservative government came into power, they reversed the changes and everything was kind of put on hold. But at that point, they did recognize the need to offer protection from reprisals to police officers who come forward with a complaint of misconduct. Now, I have criticized the legislation and said that it's weak, but let me explain why. I mean, we put into the new law that it would be an offense to take reprisal action against an officer that files a complaint. But then it's void of any consequence. So if someone did take reprisal action against an officer for reporting misconduct, what happens? I mean, there's nothing in there. There's no discipline. So what is the deterrent stopping somebody from taking reprisal action against an officer that reports misconduct? There just isn't any. So I was happy that the government did listen to my delegation, and I was happy to see that some changes were made. But as I said, that legislation seems to be on hold, and I'm not even sure if it's ever going to come to fruition. But I am totally comfortable saying in 2023 that our government does not understand the need to offer robust protections for police whistleblowers in Canada. Now, I'm not just going to spend this entire episode giving you examples of previous police whistleblowers and trying to stress the importance of lobbying government for changes. But I do want to focus on a couple of things, because if you pay attention to the news, you'd know that the RCMP has come under fire quite a bit in the last 5 to 7 years. We've got everything from the mass shooting and how the RCMP handled it in Nova Scotia in 2020. You've got the active shooter incident in New Brunswick, the class actions for sexual harassment, and even racial discrimination. There have been many reports written and many recommendations made, but has the RCMP ever listened? In my book, I quote a piece from the RCMP Gazette from 1978. It's an article titled "Police Discretionary Powers in a Democratically Responsive Society." And it was written by the Honorable Roy McMurtry. And the piece that I quote in my book says, "No one can tell an officer to take an oath which violates his conscience, and no one can tell an officer to refrain from taking an oath which he is satisfied reflects a true state of facts." Now remember, that was 1978. But 45 years later, we're still punishing police officers who follow their internal set of ethics and morals and come forward with a complaint. I wrote in my book, "Police whistleblowing results when an officer is guided by their moral obligation to their oath of office and their duty to report. Every whistleblower chooses to respect their integrity in the face of fear of retribution." I still to this day think that that definition of police whistleblowing holds true. There isn't one police whistleblower who comes forward and speaks up and doesn't expect there to be some form of reprisal, but they still do it because they know it's the right thing to do. To illustrate this further, I'm actually going to read to you directly from my book. In the spring of 2003, Human Resource Director of the RCMP and 33-year employee Denise Ravine was assigned an extensive budget review. It was then that Ravine discovered how senior RCMP officials were misspending millions of dollars of members' pension funds, and it later turned out insurance funds. Ravine compiled a massive file of evidence and turned it over to her boss, Chief Superintendent Fraser McCauley. McCauley attempted to have the evidence properly investigated, only to be removed from his position and sent to the Department of National Defense. What he believed was a punitive secondment. RCMP Commissioner Giuliano Zaccardelli stated at a Commons committee that McCauley hadn't come forward soon enough, and it wasn't a punishment transfer, but for McCauley's own good, so he could learn from his mistake. Ravine was sent packing, humiliated in public. Retired Staff Sergeant Ron Lewis made several attempts to have the matter investigated within the RCMP, and when those efforts failed, Lewis then approached the Treasury Board, Auditor General, and finally to MPs and the media. Staff Sergeant Steve Walker assisted with the Ottawa Police Service's criminal investigation. Once Interim Commissioner Bev Bussin suspected she had been deceived about the extent of senior bungling on the pension file, she leapt in. Bussin posted Hansard transcripts of every Commons Committee hearing into the scandal on the RCMP's internal website for all members to read. Bussin suspended Deputy Commissioner Barbara George and relieved Paul Govin of his duties as Chief Financial Officer. Staff Sergeant Mike Frizzell was abruptly removed from the investigation as his lines of inquiry began to lead him to suspect senior RCMP management. Frizzell's laptop was wiped clean and backup copies of data went missing. On August 21st, 2017, Frizzell filed a lawsuit against the government for $2.8 million. These officers have come to be known as the RCMP 5. What came next was years of RCMP foot-dragging, denials, and career reprisals, 3 months of embarrassing parliamentary hearings, and finally a damning report on the RCMP's mismanagement. Now, the only part I'm not reading to you are the several footnotes, because in my book I always cite the public documents that I'm referring to. But picking back up to where I left off in the book, the 5 RCMP members were awarded the RCMP's Commissioner's Commendations, the force's top honor, for their perseverance in tracking misdeeds in the force's pension fund that revealed a horribly broken management culture out of step with the RCMP's own values of honesty and accountability, a special investigator concluded. As a result of the investigation, lawyer David Brown conducted an inquiry into the ordeal and recommended a complete overhaul of top management and RCMP culture in his report. Regarding the cost to whistleblowers, Brown was quoted as saying the following: "People who speak out often pay a significant personal price in terms of their peace of mind, their professional, social, and family relationships, and their confidence in the future." Regarding the recommendations made in Brown's report, Frizzell had this to say: "Brown's recommendation was important to me personally," he admits, but adds, "It would have meant far more to me had my own organization looked into this and come to the same conclusion. This is basically vindication from a stranger who, in 6 weeks, was able to figure all this out?" When asked if it was worth it, Walker replied, "Unequivocally, the answer is yes, because, to quote my dad, the right thing will always be the right thing. If we can help make positive change in this organization, it will be worth it in the long run." So 16 years ago, lawyer David Brown recommended a complete overhaul of top management and RCMP culture. But what has changed? I know I'm biased, but I do honestly really feel proud about my book from 2017. I think it's the only honest publication about the problems in policing in Canada. I'm proud to showcase the stories of whistleblower police officers from across Canada. I believe it's important that Canadians know their names. Officers like Bob Stenhouse, who worked for the RCMP, Derek Huff, who was an Edmonton police officer, Bruce Brine, who worked in Halifax, Inspectors Jimmy Caccione and Giovanni DeFeo from Montreal, Sam Amormino of the Ontario Provincial Police, Perry Dunlop from Cornwall, Paul Manning from Hamilton, Curtis Rutt from Orangeville. I could go on, but all of these stories are covered in my book. Stories of brave police whistleblowers who knew that speaking the truth would not be popular, and in some cases even knew that it could cost them their careers, but they still did what they knew was the right thing to do. People ask all the time in every industry, how do you change culture? If we started to recognize and support police whistleblowers and protect them from retaliation, we'd be able to identify and eliminate the behaviors that are leading to the erosion of public trust in policing. I do believe the solution is actually quite simple. But the problem is that we lack the courage in government. I recently read an article about a police force in the United Kingdom, and the article was about how allegations had been made about a prostitution ring being managed by police officers, but the charges were thrown out of court because the judge was afraid of what would happen to the reputation of policing as a whole if they continued with the prosecution. Well, this is where we're headed, folks. We're headed for a world where this misconduct internally just continues to be covered up, and we'll never really know the true state of affairs within policing in Canada. And this is all simply to protect the reputation and try to preserve some element of trust. Well, where would that end? How bad would things really get before we just couldn't keep a lid on it anymore? I could stop sharing my knowledge with you tomorrow, but there will still be scandals in policing. There will still be headlines, cell phone video footage, and there will still be courageous police whistleblowers. But without protecting those people, the public have to understand that if you continue to let police whistleblowers be punished, then who are you going to be left with? I mean, think about that. Who will be the career cops that make it to 20, 30, even 40 years? It won't be the ones with integrity or high ethics and morals. Because I have yet to find the story of one police whistleblower who wasn't harmed beyond repair following their disclosure and capable of returning to the profession. I'd like to dedicate this episode to those few police officers left with their integrity intact. I see you, and it's for you that I continue to do what I do today. I dream of a day where police officers in Canada will be rewarded for their ethical courage as well as their physical courage. I hope you share that dream with me, and I hope you'll help me spread this message by sharing this episode with your friends and family. Please stay tuned for episode 2 of season 2. And if you haven't yet done so, please join my mailing list on my website at police-whistleblower.ca. That's police-whistleblower.ca to be kept apprised of the recent court decision once it is released. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.